I recently ran a poll on the community section of my channel asking if you, the viewer, wanted me to make a video about Batman: The Adventures Continue. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the results came in as overwhelmingly positive. However, one thing that caught me by surprise is that of the near 1,500 votes, a third of you claim to have no idea what Batman: The Adventures Continue actually is. Well, that's a pretty big fail on DC's part. The quick and dirty summary is that Batman: The Adventures Continue, or BTAC as I'll refer to it as from now on, is the comic book continuation of the adventures of the DC Animated Universe version of Batman. It's written by Batman the Animated Series writers/producers, Paul Dini and Alan Burnett, and was described as what they would have done had they not moved on to Batman Beyond. At time of recording, it consists of 24 issues and is broken up into 3 seasons. Originally, it started life as a DC digital first comic, meaning that it was released digitally on platforms like Comixology before it went down the crapper, and then printed later on. This was a canny move by DC because it meant that superfans like me would double dip, buying the digital and physical copies. The origins of this series can be traced back to the DC Direct Batman the Animated Series toy line. DC Direct, or DC Collectibles as they were also known, released more than 50 action figures based on the characters seen in Batman the Animated Series and the new Batman adventures over the course of several years. The BTAS line has been cited as DC Collectibles' longest running and most successful action figure line, although having said that, it wasn't without its missteps. When they ran out of popular characters, DC Collectibles decided to introduce figures of characters that had never appeared in the show, such as Azrael, Deathstroke, and the Red Hood. These characters were designed by Batman Adventures artist Ty Templeton, with biographies written by Paul Dini. Now, as you can imagine, some hardcore fans weren't pleased with this development. After all, we were waiting for the new Batman Adventures versions of the Mad Hatter, the Penguin, Clayface plus Annie, as well as Lockup, Maxie Zeus, Rupert Thorne, Batwoman, the list goes on. And I get that some of those characters wouldn't have mainstream commercial appeal. Who besides me would buy a Leslie Tompkins action figure? It still sucked that we never got them. And just a quick note to say that no, Todd McFarlane's more recent range of BTAS figures does not soothe the wound. Firstly, because he's just re-releasing old models with slightly different paint jobs, and secondly, because they're Target exclusives, which makes them very hard to get a hold of outside of the US. Thanks, Todd! But I digress. To go alongside these new action figures, DC brought on Paul Dini, Alan Burnett, and Ty Templeton to produce Batman: The Adventures Continue, a comic book miniseries that would introduce these characters to the DCAU. It was a dream team, bringing together the talent behind the animated series and the writer-artist that had worked on BTAS tie-in comics, arguably some of the best Batman comics of the 90s. Although, it is kind of ironic that prior to BTAS, cartoons were primarily used as vehicles to sell action figures to kids, things like Mask or Visionaries. You can't say it any other way. But BTAS had broken the mould by being a high quality show first and foremost, that also happened to have some action figures. Yet, some 30 years later, a BTAS comic book was brought into existence to help persuade fans into buying more action figures. Now, as great as it sounded on paper, the series wasn't perfect. The first season centered on a mysterious figure watching Batman and co from the shadows waiting to strike. Now, this was obviously Jason Todd, but it was presented as a mystery to readers. The whole Red Hood storyline raised some continuity questions, as it was revealed that Jason Todd had briefly been Robin during the time that passed between Dick Grayson's departure after Batman the Animated Series and Tim Drake becoming Robin in the new Batman adventures. That in itself isn't necessarily a problem, it's just that the DCAU version of Tim Drake was already heavily inspired by Jason Todd, so bringing in Jason and having such a similar backstory to Tim Drake, it just felt kind of off. Especially when they could have used this as an opportunity to explain the red Robin costume that was on display in the trophy cabinet in the Batcave during the new Batman adventures. Instead, they used the more comics-accurate Robin suit. Now I just have to tell myself it was Dick Grayson's training suit and try to forget about it. Throw in some other controversial changes, such as the off-panel death of Nora Freeze, and some dialogue that suggests that the story is taking place in the modern day rather than in the 90s. Deathstroke references September 11th. The Joker talks about his HBO Max account, forever dating the series since the service is called Max now, and you can see why some of the most hardcore fans might dismiss this comic. After all, they often state, BTAS took place in the early 90s. Look at Charlie Collins' driver's license, for God's sake. There's all the proof we need. Therefore, any mention of modern things like streaming services makes this null and void. Now, this might be a controversial opinion, but I don't agree with that assessment. The thing with comic books, and to a certain extent the DC animated universe, is that they're not supposed to take place at any specific point in time. They operate on what is known as a sliding timeline. Justice League is always taking place in the present day. BTAS took place about a decade ago. Batman Beyond will always take place about 40 years from now. This notion of sliding timelines is very common in comic books. It's how the Fantastic Four can interact with President Richard Nixon, while Spider-Man goes on adventures with President Barack Obama. You're supposed to just gloss over the details that date the story and focus on the bigger picture. See the forest instead of looking at the individual trees. And I know that some people can't get past the perceived continuity contradictions, but the fact that these stories were written by Paul Dini and Alan Burnett, two of the key BTAS architects, makes them canon in my mind. And that's it as far as I'm concerned. Now, I'm not saying you have to like these stories, and to be frank, I didn't think much of the first season, aside from the bonus 8th issue featuring the ventriloquist and Scarface at Christmas. But just because you don't like something, that doesn't mean it isn't valid. Feel free to ignore them though, it honestly wouldn't change much if you did. By the time the second season began, Warner Brothers had closed DC Collectibles, ending the BTAS action figure line before several of the figures could be released. Designs for Talon from the Court of Owls, Hush, Flashpoint Batman and Vampire Batman would be shown, but these figures will never be released, at least unless Todd McFarlane gets his hands on them, and as such, the overwhelming majority of these designs didn't appear in BTAC. I'd argue that without this mandate to use characters from the toy line, the series got a lot better. Without having a toy line to promote, the team were able to write more varied, interesting stories about characters that they clearly had something to say about. Season 2 was a big improvement in that it didn't have a subplot running through the entire story. Instead, it was a series of shorter stories that introduced new original characters like The Muscle, a skilled assassin for hire, and Mayor Mayhem, Gotham's former corrupt mayor from back when Batman first donned his costume. Season 3 meanwhile revived the Valestra family mob, introducing the daughter of Sal Valestra from Mask of the Phantasm, Esta Valestra, which is a lot of fun to say, and connected back to Ty Templeton's earlier Batman Adventures comics by featuring Black Mask, who was a very prominent villain in Batman Adventures Volume 2. Similarly, established characters that rarely got attention like Renee Montoya, Huntress, and even Jazzman Jimmy Peak from I Am the Night, you know, that guy who shot Commissioner Gordon, were also given the spotlight in the series. Montoya was brought into line with her mainstream DC continuity counterpart by being an open lesbian, and Jazzman became a substitute for Victor Zsasz. Instead of carving notches into his flesh with every murder, however, he would get a musical note tattooed on his body for each victim. Each season ended with stories featuring large gatherings of villains. Season 1 had Harley's Christmas Party, Season 2 had the confrontation at Arkham Asylum, while Season 3 saw the villains being rounded up and imprisoned in an inescapable jail. It's almost as if Dini and Burnett were expecting each season to be their last, and so they wanted to get as many characters in there as possible for the fans. I particularly like how Season 3's final page ends with Batman and Robin driving off into the sunrise, chasing after Man-Bat. Considering how BTAS began, with Batman encountering Man-Bat in On Leather Wings, it's fitting that the final story ends in a similar way. It would be a shame if BTAC had really ended, but I have little faith in it being renewed. In the early press material for Season 3, it was billed as the final season, and Ty Templeton stated pretty much the same thing on his Facebook page when Season 3 ended. I am still holding out hope that the BTAS Reunion podcast that was announced a few years ago could be released as a comic now that Kevin Conroy is no longer with us, but to be honest, I'm not holding my breath. As someone that is a big fan of the tie-in comics, Batman Adventures, Batman and Robin Adventures, Gotham Adventures and Batman Adventures Volume 2, I really appreciate how Batman The Adventures Continue acts as a bridge between the tie-in comics and the cartoons. For years, people had questioned the canonicity of those comics, pointing at instances where there's a direct contradiction to something that came later on in a different show, like Superman's mullet from Batman Adventures 25. Look, it was the 90s, things were different back then. But I find it's best to just squint past these frankly minor issues and celebrate the fact that we're getting more stories set in this wonderful universe long after the TV shows have ended. If you're a BTAS fan, and I have every reason to think you are if you're watching one of my videos, then I really recommend checking out Batman The Adventures Continue. Season 1 and Season 2 are readily available from retailers like Amazon as a collection, while the Season 3 collected edition is coming out in early 2024. So there's plenty of opportunities for you to pick it up, read it for yourself, and make up your own mind.